And you are live.
Welcome back to House Education, Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025. We're gonna now get a look at the work of the State Board of Education, sort of what they're up to, but also what their role is in the world of education, especially as we move forward on debating some of the big proposals coming from the administration. And if there were some follow-up questions from some of our previous presentations, perhaps we can ask some of that. And hopefully, we will also talk a fair bit about education quality standards, the role of the state board with those, sort of what they mean and how they are enforced or implemented. Floor is yours if you would introduce yourselves and go ahead with your presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Jack Samuelson. I'm the chair of the Vermont State Board of Education, joined also by Dr. Tammy Colby.
I'm Tammy, for the record, I'm Tammy Colby. I'm the vice chair of the State Board of Education.
So thank you for having us here this morning. We've been asked to provide sort of two different buckets of review for you guys. The first is just a general overview on the State Board of Education. So I have a slideshow, which I believe you all have, which I can walk through with you. And then more specifically, we'll drill down on the education quality standards, which Tammy was one of our co-chairs on that rule update committee. So she has a presentation that she can walk through. And if you all have questions, we can answer that. So this is, I think, the third year that I've sort of done this overview of the State Board of Ed, and every year I kind of fine-tune it and add in a little more detail. So hopefully this will give you a good sense of what we're doing. So our membership is set by 16 VSA section 161. We have 11 total state board members, which is comprised of 8 non-student members, with priority given to the selection of persons with a demonstrated commitment to ensuring quality education for Vermont students. Board members typically serve a term of 6 years beginning in March 1st, unless board members step into someone else's position, and then they could, then take 6 years on top of that. We have 2 student members who each serve a 2-year term. They are non-voting the first year and then voting the second year, so have full board member rights as a student. And actually the students that we've had have been very engaged and really contribute to the conversations, the things that we're considering. And then finally, the Secretary of Education is a non-voting member of the board. All members are appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. And then you have a slide that lists out all 11 board members, and I sort of broke it down so that you can see where board members are from, as well as the experience or interest that they bring to the board. And I think the important thing to note there is we are pretty geographically diverse. We've got good representation of teachers, former teachers, heads of school, principals, school board members, professors, CTE heads. So we've got pretty good diversity there. Then I just want to pause because there was a pretty seismic shift in the relationship with the State Board of Ed and the Agency of Ed in 2012. So prior to 2012, we were more like a traditional board. We oversaw the Commissioner of Education. We selected the Commissioner of Education. We directed the work of the Department of Education, and we directed policy and technical direction of the department, including rulemaking and developing regulations. We also supervised the commissioner. But in 2012, with Act 98, that all changed. And so the commissioner was elevated to a secretary position that reports directly to the governor. It established the Agency of Education, and the state board is no longer responsible for overseeing agency policies, programs, or resources. We still do retain oversight with respect to the rulemaking process, but the agency is responsible for implementing the rules and regulations adopted by the board. So we've worked really hard to have good communication with the agency as we are engaged in rulemaking, so that we make sure that the rules that we are proposing are actually implementable from the agency's perspective. And it just points to that importance of being in good communication with the agency. But I think the other thing to take away here is that we do not direct the secretary, we don't direct the agency. The agency reports directly to the governor, and the governor actually is the one now who selects the secretary. So the state board last year was responsible for conducting the secretary search. And by statute, we proposed 3 candidates to the governor for his ultimate selection. So the way the board is now, we do sit in a rather unique position. We are independent. We are a public forum, so all of our meetings are warned and open to the public. We have public comment at the beginning and the end of every full board meeting, and at least at the beginning of every committee meeting. We really do encourage and welcome input from the public with the work that we're doing. We're a neutral body, so we act consistent with legislative intent, and we advise the General Assembly when we are invited to do so. We also serve a quasi-judicial role in some circumstances. This was more relevant a couple of years ago. So there were rate appeals by therapeutic schools or tuition appeals. We are charged in statute with sitting in that quasi-judicial capacity. That hasn't come up for a couple of years, but it's still a possibility. We also are in charge pursuant to 16 VSA section 261 with the organization and adjustment of supervisor unions and supervisory districts. And of course, we've retained the authority to engage in rulemaking pursuant to 16 VSA section 164(7). So how do we determine our work? Basically, there are 3 ways that the board can receive work. One is if something is listed in statute. So for example, 16 VSA section 164 lists out 21 responsibilities of the State Board of Education. 16 VSA section 165 is the statute that authorizes the education quality standards, which the board just did a pretty massive rewrite of last year. We also get our responsibilities through legislative acts. So for instance, Act 46, the board was in charge of determining the mergers of different school districts. And also Act 173 spawned a series of rulemaking by the board in order to comply with what was set forth in the act. And then of course we have our rules, and our rules, we are able, since there are rules, to open them at any time, but I'll circle back on that. As far as executing our work, by statute, we shall be supported by adequate staff to report to the board. As a practical matter, we have no staff. We are deeply grateful to the Agency of Education, Maureen Gaddis and Suzanne Sprague from the agency assist the board with warning our meetings, taking our minutes, really doing all of that background work to facilitate our meetings. But beyond that, we don't really have any support. It would be nice if we had more support, just because it does leave a lot of gaps in the work that we're trying to get done. Typically, we meet monthly. So we meet typically on the 3rd Wednesday of every month. We try, since COVID, we're doing a combination of in-person meetings and hybrid meetings because we found that hybrid meetings are actually easier for the public to attend. So there is value in that, but there's also value in being in person and seeing schools. So there's no magic to that, but we typically try to meet in person about 4 times a year, maybe more. And we often try to honor board members who are going off, whether student members or adult members, by going to visit their school, which has allowed the board to see a lot of different schools throughout the state. We also hold special meetings as required for the performance of our duties, and we typically hold 3 or 4, maybe 5 of those a year, depending on the need. And then during Oliver Olson's tenure as the chair of the board, he established a committee structure, which we found is really, really helpful because it allows us to farm out the work so that instead of having the whole board engage in rulemaking, we have different committees set up to look at that, and then the committee comes back to the full board for a discussion and vote on it. So we found that to be a pretty efficient way to get things done. For organization, by statute, we select a chair biennially. We also select a vice chair at that time, and then I just went through the committee structure. So the next slide reviews the different committees that we have. And in 2024, we had 11 monthly meetings. We took the month of July off. We had 3 special meetings and we had 27 committee meetings. And so you can see for each of those committees, how many meetings each committee had, as well as who serves on those committees. And the first one shows EQS, SPS. I was running out of space. So that was the Education Quality Standards Committee that oversaw the updates to Rule Series 2000, which Tammy will be talking about momentarily. Once that work was done, the committee's work was discharged, but we took the same group of people and renamed it the Student Performance Standards Committee because pursuant to 16 VSA 164.9, the state board is also in charge of overseeing student performance standards and making sure that they dovetail with the education quality standards. So historically, that's been things like Common Core. We just updated the health and physical education standards, and the committee is currently now looking at student performance standards that have been proposed by the Act One working group with regard to ethnic study standards. So in 2024, this is just a brief overview of the work that we did. We concluded our updates to Rule Series 2000. So these establish the standards to ensure that all Vermont students are afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal in quality and are equitable, anti-racist, culturally responsive, anti-discriminatory, and inclusive. And those rules will go into effect July 1st of this year. We also reopened for the second time in a couple of years, Rule Series 2200, which govern independent school approvals. And we performed work in a few different areas. Primarily, we applied the principles and goals of Act One to independent schools and adopted the same substantive language as that was used in Rule Series 2000. We also introduced a requirement that independent schools must complete and submit annual assurances of their compliance with the rules. And I did catch the tail end of Beth St. James. So as she mentioned, if the school is approved, the time frame ranges, but on average, call it 5 years. What this requirement does is it says during that intervening time period, every year the school has to submit an assurance. So that it just allows more of a checkpoint between the school and the agency and the board. So I do know that those assurances were sent out by the agency, I believe, last week, and I expect the agency will be getting the assurances back. The updates to Rule Series 2200 also provided a comprehensive framework of the requirements that accrediting agencies must meet in order to be recognized by the board. So there are accrediting agencies such as NEASC and ASME that accredit schools. And it used to be, there was Rule 7320 that listed those agencies by name. And what the board found is that the list was really outdated. And of course, to engage in rulemaking is at least an 8-month process. We decided what was probably a better way to go about it instead of listing by name is to create a framework. So that's now embedded in Rule Series 2200. And then we have a list on our website that lists the accrediting agencies. So it's, I think, a better way to set up that framework, but it also allows us to be more nimble in terms of putting organizations on the list or off the list. We also require a method by which the agency will evaluate whether a school is compliant with our non-discrimination requirements. And we clarify the process by which accredited and non-accredited schools may apply for and receive approval or reapproval. And just as a reminder, there are no approvals at this point because there's a moratorium on approval of any new independent schools. So we're just at this point looking at reapprovals. So those rules went into effect on July 1st of last year, with the exception of instructional strategies and curriculum content, which will go into effect July 1st of this year. And then the third, major bucket of work that the board completed last year was we approved 2 post-secondary schools. And again, we went through the process, and there are 3 accrediting agencies that have now been recognized by the board. So current issues facing the State Board of Ed, one, insufficient resources to meet workflow demands. So in FY24, our total budget for all board members, travel, advertising, recording costs, total budget was $70,708, and we have been level funded since FY21. Prior to that, it was significantly more, so it got cut pretty significantly in 2021. It has not been increased since then. Board members earn $6.25 an hour or $50 a meeting. You can imagine that's not very much money. And of course, we have no dedicated legal support. And I guess the important thing here is that if we just kind of continue, back burnering our work, we have enough money to make it through this fiscal year and going forward. If we want to do any substantive work, such as rulemaking or, continuing with looking at the performance standards that have been given to us by the Act One Working Group, we would like to hire a consultant. We don't have any money in our budget to do that. So we're a little bit stuck at the moment where we have work that we can identify needs to be done that we would like to do. But I think we have about $35,000 left in our budget to make it through the rest of the fiscal year. So without additional money, we can't really get the work done that we would like to get done. So we don't have funds to hire a consultant. We don't have funds to hire an attorney to assist us with updates to our rules, including the career and technical education rules, which really are the final step. We updated the education quality standards. We updated the independent school approval rules. This is sort of the last leg of that tripod. We don't have funds to hire an attorney to help us do that. And we don't have funds to fully discharge our statutory obligations. So requests that we might make of the General Assembly is we feel it would be really beneficial to the board to have dedicated legal counsel. Currently, if we need an attorney, we have to put a contract out to bid. We have to go through that process. From the time we articulate a need for legal services until the time we actually have someone who's able to help us is about 3 months, which leaves us stranded. And that attorney is only able to assist us for work that falls within the scope of that contract. So if we have another question that comes up, we don't have an attorney. And we thought it would be really helpful to have an attorney on retainer. We estimate that cost would be about $36,000 a year. So that when questions come up, it's literally, we can pick up the phone, send an email, and be able to have that level of support. We would also love to see increased compensation for board members. I say this, I'm not sure it's going to happen in my tenure on the board, but I do point out that this is good work that we're doing. And we think it's important to have differences in perspectives and life experiences. It is hard to be able to be fully engaged with this work on the modest stipend that board members get. So I just point that out because I think it would be really important to be able to make this something that would be, that would enable more people to engage in this kind of work, because I think there's real interest out there. We would love to have a one-time line adjustment to our current FY25 budget to allow us to spend up to $40,000 for a consultant to assist us in reviewing the proposed ethnic studies standards that have been proposed by the Act One Working Group. And we would also request $25,000 to retain legal counsel to assist with updates to our Rule Series 2370 for the career and tech rules. So that would be in addition to the having counsel on retainer. And then looking to FY26 and beyond, we would love to have additional funding that would allow us to update our rules. Many of our rules have not been updated in almost 30 years. Anytime you look at a state board rule that references the commissioner, it's at least 13 years old. Those rules are in desperate need of being updated, but again, we don't have the funds or the support that would allow us to do that. And of course, we would like additional funding to meet the other obligations that have been set forth in statute. And that really raises a larger question. I realize that the education landscape is sort of shifting on almost every front, and the state board is a part of that. And so I think to you, I would ask, what do you see as the state board's role going forward? And what can we do to assist that conversation? Thank you.
I would say that is a question that we assigned to the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. And I'm not sure we necessarily want to get ahead of that, but a valuable question. Just very quickly, what I'm interpreting here is actually a budget adjustment act for $65,000, 40 for somebody to help with the Act One review, and 25 to help with new CTE rules or updated CTE rules.
And just to clarify that, yes, you are correct. And to that, I would add, if we were to have a council on retainer, estimated at $36,000 a year, I think the fair response would be to tack on $18,000 in this fiscal year for, half of that annual amount, and then, roll it to future years going forward. And then the $25,000 for CTE, the attorney that we had assisting us with the updates to EQS in 2200, it was about $55,000 to update each rule series. So we could fairly estimate that it would cost about $50,000 for CTE, but again, we're halfway through the fiscal year, so $25,000 this year, $25,000 next year to finish the work.
And what additional, for increased compensation for board members, ballpark? Let's throw it in.
I mean, I'm not trying to hedge on that one. I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like other boards, other state boards are either getting the same amount that we're getting, or I know that there are other boards where members are getting, 5 and 6 figures a year for the work that we're doing. I would say this is not a full-time job. Sometimes feels like a full-time job. But I think we spend a lot of time working on these issues, and late nights, weekends, holidays. It's, I have a job in my real life, and I often find that this work comes first because I'm constrained by statutory deadlines. So then that ends up, shifting the other work that I thought I was going to be doing to later in the day, because this work needs to happen first. I don't have an answer for you, honestly. I would love to say something that is on par with other boards that are doing similar work, and I don't have that information. So I feel like I can raise the issue, and it's not compelling if I don't have a number. I mean, I can make up a number, but I would rather have a real number.
I actually think that board compensation variables is something we can put our hands on pretty quickly from the joint fiscal office, and how different they are.
But thank you.
Sorry, I don't think you recognized me, and I just asked my
I
question.
was looking at that,
Apologize.
that's okay. So that's it for part one.
Yes, unless you have other questions. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Any further questions? Obviously, from the topic of the state board and all that, I assume will become part of the bigger debate that we're gonna have, depending on what the governor proposes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to shift here to the education quality standards. As Chair Samuelson mentioned, this was a significant body of work for the past few years for the State Board of Education. And just to sort of put this work in context, the education quality standards establish the standards for public schools that all public schools need to meet to ensure that Vermont students have equal educational opportunities. So if you think about it, the EQS are those core rules and regulations that talk to schools and districts around the state about how they do their work on a day-to-day basis. And it's the regulatory framework that is intended to ensure that we have substantially equal educational opportunities across all public schools. There's a separate set of rules that apply to independent schools. So I'm going to be talking about the EQS, which applies to public schools, with a few exceptions of independent schools that opt in to the EQS. And there's a handful of schools. I just mentioned that because that came up in that exchange you just had, Representative Collins. So there are a handful of independent schools that opt into the EQS, but the majority of our independent schools fall under our independent school years. But it means that this canon of rules is really important, right? That this is what school principals and school boards lean back on and use to guide their work. It talks to them about curriculum requirements. It talks to them about staffing. It talks to them about the kinds of reporting that they have to do. And so this set of rules was last updated in 2014. So it's been quite some time since we updated them, and it's important that the EQS reflect what's currently in statute, right? And so the impetus for updating the rules this time around were the changes in statute that came with Act 1 of 2019. And out of Act 1 was created the Act 1 working group. And they were charged with providing recommendations back to the state board for how the EQS needed to be modified to comply with Act 1. And so that was our starting point for this work. And the changes as a result of Act 1, right? What did Act 1 in and of itself ask of us? Act 1 requires the education quality standards to be established in a way that would increase cultural competency of students in grades PK-12, increase the attention to history, contribution, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, promote critical thinking regarding the history, contributions, and perspectives of ethnic and social groups, commit supervisory unions to eradicate racial bias in their curricula, provide across their curricula content and methods that enable students to safely explore questions of identity, race equality, and racism, and 6, ensure that the basic curriculum and extracurricular programs of all supervisory unions are welcoming to all students and account for parental concerns about religion or culture. So that was the starting point. That's what Act 1 put on the table and said that the EQS now needed to attend to. So when those recommendations came to the state board, we said, well, we're opening up these rules. These rules haven't been updated since 2014. We also need to take into account the broader set of considerations. Again, policy changes, input on implementability of the rules as they have been, right? And other kinds of concerns raised by the legislature and constituents across the state. So the SBE approved further modifications to the revisions proposed by the Act 1 Working Group to ensure that the EQS was consistent with current statute, whether or not we took into account the extent to which the EQS was understandable and able to be implemented in the field. That included both the recommendations that came from the Act 1 Working Group as well as provisions that were in the EQS already, where the field was struggling and potentially needed clarification. Technical changes recommended by the Agency of Education and the field to bring the document current with policy and practice. A lot has changed through 2014 in education. 4, to bring the EQS in alignment with the newly proposed district quality standards. And the district quality standards, just to remind us all, those were put into, were part of Act 127. And the Agency of Education was asked to create those rules and regulations. That's the only set of rules currently that the agency has oversight over, and they are not under the state board. And so we have 2 sets of rules, one by the agency, that's the district quality standards, and then we have the education quality standards. And we needed to make sure that these 2 things work together, right? Because if they aren't working together, that creates a lot of friction and challenges for our practitioners in the field. And then, as I'll show you in a moment, we took a lot of input from the field and the public about the rules' impact on educational programs and practices. And again, with an eye toward implementability and consistency with statute. So we had both the Act 1 body of work that came to us, and then we had all of these other things that we considered. So what you can see on this slide is the process. It was a 2-year process. This is a much longer process than usual. I want to acknowledge that. And I know that's been a sort of comment that has sort of come back to the state board that this took a long time. Let me talk about why that is. It took 2 years because, one, this is probably the most impactful set of regulations that we have for public schools in Vermont, and we need to get them right. And the kinds of recommendations that are coming in from the Act 1 Working Group are extremely important, but they're new, right? This is new terrain, not just in Vermont, but nationally. And we need to be very thoughtful about that. And we are very thankful to the Act 1 Working Group for their recommendations and partnerships in this work. We also have a rules series that hadn't been updated in a long time. And there was a lot of things to And so starting in April 2022, we received the recommendations of the Act 1 Working Group. And between April 2022 and May 2023, the EQS committee met 28 times. And in each one of those meetings, we had individuals or groups come testify before us. Some of those meetings were working meetings, but we always had public comment at the beginning and the end. And out of that, we took a hard look at the definitions, sort of around curriculum instruction, technical changes, application to independent schools, alignment with district quality standards, and we had a legal review. Out of that, then, we made recommendations back to the board, and the board in 2023 voted unanimously to approve the rule. ICAR filing, it was filed by ICAR. So all that work happened before we actually started the formal rulemaking process. And I think that's also really important because oftentimes those of you who know me will hear me say, state board's the public and the public education, right? That entire process over that entire years was about public engagement, right? And really thinking and taking that work, taking those comments and taking that feedback in. So that when we started the ICAR, when we started the formal rulemaking process with ICAR, we were already in a position where we had done substantial work in engagement with the public around this set of rules. After ICAR, we had 3 public hearings with 180 attendees in total. And we took in over 100 written comments. From that, we had another series of 14 meetings where we processed all the comments, made additional updates to the rule, including 2 meetings where we met with our companion committee that was working on the 2200 series. Because one of the things the state board decided is that we wanted to make sure, to the extent possible, that the same educational quality standards that we put in place in public schools were also there on our independent school rules. Under current statute, we are not able to have one unified set of rules for both public and independent schools, but to the extent possible, we wanted to make sure that the same equal educational opportunities that are available to students in public schools are available to students in independent schools. The state board unanimously approved the rule in April 2024, and LCAR unanimously approved the rule in June 2024. The rule goes into effect July 1st, 2025. So it took a little bit of time, but what I will say is that rule now is the foundation. It's the starting point in many ways for what we'll do with CTE rules. It was the foundation for how the 2200 rules were updated. Right? And so getting that right is really important. And now we're able to, because we've done that work, to able to update these other rule series. And I think we've created a framework now that will allow the state board to more easily update that rule for changes in statute going forward. I want to just acknowledge there's a lot of meetings, a lot of work. And I just want to acknowledge the people on this committee who did this work. It was co-chaired by Kim Gleason, who I know some of you know, former school board chair at Essex. Mohammed Dia, who's an educator at Winooski. Greg Farron, who's one of our student members from Vergennes. Rich Warner from East Dover. And we had this, the committee went on for a while, so we had some former members, Patrick Brown of Burlington, Tom Levitt from St. Johnsbury, and Gabrielle Lucci, who was also a student member. So as Chair Samuelson mentioned, we're not exactly done with this. EQS is done, but one of the things that the state board is required to do in addition to rulemaking is we also have to consider and approve standards from the state, right? And so those are our authority for that are 2 different sections of statute. The standards are things like Common Core, National Next Generation Science Standards, the Health and PE standards. So we just created this EQS that includes sort of this framework for thinking about social equity, right? Well, we have no standards for that. And so we need standards, and standards being those things that we measure the extent to which students can know or can do something. In Vermont, we, the state board or the agency, don't prescribe curriculum, but we prescribe standards to which, right, all students should aspire. And so we don't have social equity standards right now. The Act One Working Group provided to us an initial framework called the IRIS framework, Vermont State Ethnic Studies framework. That framework has recommendations for standards as well as other kinds of recommendations around curriculum and instruction. Currently, in June of 2023, they provided that to us. It was a little difficult for us to start evaluating and considering that because we hadn't finished the EQS, right? We need to make sure these things line up. So immediately following when the EQS was approved in June, we started the process of considering those recommended standards, and we began that process in the fall. And we are currently in our standards committee working through that process now. It's going to be really important that we sort out those standards prior to July 1st, because that's when the EQS is having to do that. So the work is still continuing. we've moved on to the standards. And in your handouts, in case you need it handy, is a link to the final adopted Rule 2000 and also a link to the IRIS framework that was shared with us in the afternoon. Happy to take questions.
Just back to a little bit of the financial part.
Yeah.
There was a lot of committee meetings.
There was a lot of confusion.
Are those compensated at the same rate as the state board meetings?
Yes.
Okay. So I think one of the big questions that I always have and that, I think everybody is, so we've got EQS, we've got the standards. How do we assure that schools are meeting those standards, are using those standards appropriately?
Yeah.
And that may not be a state board responsibility, probably isn't.
Under the current governance configuration, right? And that came about after 2012, right? The Agency of Education is responsible for overseeing implementation of the rules. We do not oversee the agency, and so our role right now is to create the rules, approve the standards, and then the agency's responsibility is to both support implementation, right, in the ways that it can, but also is responsible for accountability and monitoring with respect to implementation. Where there's gray areas is who then is supervising the agency with respect to ensuring that they are sort of doing their job with respect to implementations. And that is sort of that's a question mark, right? And I know that question has come up.
I might harken back to the testimony we had right before you came, and just ask, given sort of all of the legal maneuverings and all of that, where do we stand on independent school approval process for those schools who have submitted their renewal application, but have put the asterisk next to the anti-discrimination portion? Are they continuing to receive public dollars? Why? Just where does that stand?
So I think, I'm trying to remember, because this goes back to the February 2023 state board meeting, so a couple of years ago. There were, I believe, 3 schools that submitted forms with an asterisk. 2 of them dropped out and elected to be recognized and to not seek public tuition dollars. The 3rd school is subject to a lawsuit, so I probably won't say any more than that. But what I will say is, with the assurance form that the agency has developed that was sent out again, I believe it was last week, sent out to all independent schools. And there's a checkbox, are you approved but not eligible to receive tuition? Are you approved and eligible to receive tuition? Are you a therapeutic school? And depending on your answer, there is a series of assurances the school is asked to check off. The agency will then be receiving that information, and then based on the agency's preparation of a report, it will then come before our 2200 approvals committee for their consideration, and then ultimately before the full board. So where we are right now, we have not done any reapprovals of independent schools for more than a year. We've sort of been in a holding pattern as schools and the agency are sort of getting up to speed on these updates to our rules. What I've heard from the agency is beginning in the spring, we're going to start, those floodgates will open, and the state board is going to be receiving a lot of requests for reapproval. But the process is the agency, sort of collects that information and then gives it to the board. So at this point, I don't have an answer for you, but I do think that information will be coming within the next few months.
And is that reapproval on the 5-year cycle that's coming, or is that all everybody?
Well, it depends on the school. So if you're a kindergarten, I believe the approval period can only be 2 years. I know that in years past, we've had schools up for reapproval that we have only approved for a year, and then we've asked them to come back before the board because there was something in the application that the board just wanted to make sure that that the issue that we saw was going to be rectified within a year, and so we had an approval for a 1-year period or a 2-year period, but the general rule is a 5-year period.
And just to clarify, I think your question, Representative Carmen, is there was no reset here where everybody had to restart reapproval. We will be taking in reapprovals as they come up in whatever time-bound cycle, which varies, right? As they come up in that cycle. So with the change in rule, there was no reset that said, okay, everyone now has to go back through the reapproval process under the rules. What's going to happen is that as they come up against their clock, right, and they come to seek reapproval, then they will be evaluated against the new rules formally.
You talk about going into the CTE rules. They have not been updated in a decade or so. If we get a proposal and we start talking about it very seriously in here about sort of a change in governance and funding for CTEs as opposed to content, how might that affect your needs in updating CTE rules?
I think that's a good question. So the process that we have right now that we're going to be engaging is that the Agency of Education is going to take a first pass making technical recommendations to us with regard to substance. We're expecting those technical recommendations sometime this spring. So given sort of how this process works and that again, will want to be engaging the public and representatives from the CTE constituencies, I think we would be in a position to start the technical review on that. If in fact then there were additional governance changes, we certainly would need to consider those and their implications for rules.
That's helpful to know, just from our own sort of planning purposes, that it sort of originates at the AOE, goes to you.
And
I
this
know
is,
there were
But that's
a
an
major
agreed
report.
upon process for CTE.
and this is the first time that that's happened.
Yeah.
So we, had this conversation with the agency probably in the spring and, thought that that would really make sense. So the agency really can put a first pass on it before we take the rule and then, have the formal rulemaking process.
And as you might remember, that's a shift from what the agency requested last session before you, which was for the agency to take ownership of the rule. And I think our position on that was that it is really important that the EQS, independent schools, and CTE rules all be with the same body, right? Those three rules need to stay hand in glove. It should never be the case that a child crosses the hallway in a school from a public school setting to a CTE setting, for example, and have different sets of rules or have these rules not work together. And so our recommendation was that those three rules need to stay together. And you can already see, for example, how the state board has been very careful to make sure that our EQS and the 2200 rules mirror one another to the extent possible allowed by statute. It will be our intent to do that under CTE. And so after that discussion and where things landed at the General Assembly, we had a conversation with the agency, and we very much value the agency's input and want their technical expertise on this, given where the rules are housed right now. So the agreement that we reached with them is that they would take the first pass to provide that technical information. And then we would engage in our rulemaking process that looks very similar to what we did on EQS, which would be a thoroughly publicly engaged process prior to filing ICAR, right? And then taking it through the ICAR process.
I think that was also one of the compelling reasons that we did not go along with the agency's request, because the state board process is so much more public.
Yeah, well, similar question to yours, but a different part of, in the new, I'm getting all my numbers right, 2200, and the new rules for approved independent schools to receive public tuition, you asked about where we are sort of implementation of the non-discrimination clause. There are also changes to special education, I think, and what's required for providing special education. And so so those would go into effect July 1, 2025, or those already are in effect?
They're
So one, a
already in
date
effect.
question, and two, like an implementation. Do we know if that is being implemented?
So that requirement already went into effect. And if you think about, in my mind, I'm sort of analogizing like a tax form and like what's above the line and what's below the line. So to be approved, and so approved means you meet all of the standards set forth in Rule Series 2200. To be approved, you need to comply with the non-discrimination requirements. To be approved to and eligible to receive public tuition, that's kind of below the line, if you will. So to be approved, you've got to meet the non-discrimination requirements, regardless of whether or not you receive public tuition. To also be eligible to receive public tuition, you need to comply with special ed laws. That went into effect July 1st of 2024, and the assurance form that the agency has now sent out to all independent schools will be capturing that information.
And Representative Ray, the state board reviewed that assurance form several times, once in the spring and once again in the fall, and we provided some very specific feedback on that form to ensure that that form was consistent with the rule and also federal law. So my understanding is that the form has been updated to reflect state board input, but that was an instance where the state board had some very specific feedback on how the agency was going to implement the rule.
Probably there's a little bit of follow-up question and probably a good thing for us to be asking agency. So the sort of accountability or check back of, are we meeting EQS or are we meeting the rule 2200? So for approved independent schools is a pretty lengthy attestation form. For public schools and EQS, what is that? Again, this maybe is the question you're asking, and maybe it's the question for the AOE or even in the field. Are they similar attestation forms? Is it a review process? Is it how is that?
Yeah. So under the new district quality standards, there are ways, right, that the agency, there's a framework for the district that they need to provide evidence that they are doing certain kinds of things around operations, financial and facilities, right? There's a reference in the DQS that goes back to, the EQS with respect to very specific things in there that are points of monitoring and accountability for districts with respect to aspects of the EQS. In the DQS, those things that are listed are just listed as sections of the EQS, and the agency is responsible for developing a specific guidance that districts must follow to meet or be accountable for these things. That guidance is yet to be promulgated. Once that guidance is promulgated, then the agency will be responsible as a part of the district quality process to be making sure that those specific aspects of the EQS, but it is a very specific list, is not the full EQS. In the EQS, districts also have responsibilities with respect to reporting, right, information. And one of the ways in which I think we strengthen the EQS is with respect to the types of data and information that they are now required to put in their annual plans that are available to the public, including disaggregated data around that help us understand patterns of equity or inequity in a district with respect to district characteristics.
And those are some new requirements in the EQS?
There are some new requirements with respect to reporting, and those reporting requirements are not exclusive to students who physically attend the district. They include students for whom the district is responsible, and that includes students who attend independent schools who are placed out of the district. So to your question, right, there are some frameworks set up here, right? But again, the accountability monitoring work is on the agency's shoulders.
All right, thank you. We'll break for lunch now. We're on a tight deadline in terms of the Budget Adjustment Act. Some of what information you have provided, we may be unsuccessful in working with. I would just highly recommend that you follow up with our colleagues at the other side of the building.
We can prepare something written for you. We just
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to.